Peaceful greetings and welcome to another episode of Words That Inspire by Chizoba. And the topic I am going to be addressing today is spiritual abuse and pastor worship. To me, they kind of go hand in hand, but for this recording, I am going to talk about the first half. So this is part one, and that is spiritual abuse. It is not a term I've heard often, but it is a thing. Just like there is physical abuse and emotional abuse, there is spiritual abuse. And I came across a definition. It says any attempt to exert power and control over someone using religion, faith, or beliefs can be spiritual abuse. The way I personally define it is sort of similar. To me, spiritual abuse is taking advantage of someone using their religion or their faith or their beliefs. Spiritual abuse happens in any denomination, in any religion. It's not just something that's unique to pastors or to Christians. However, I am going to be looking at the topic through the lens of a Christian because I am a Christian. So I am going to be talking about or looking at spiritual abuse in the Christian church, but wherever there is a spiritual leader in any religion, spiritual abuse does exist. Part of the reason it does is the way we are raised to view spiritual leaders. All too often we are taught from childhood to take the words of a spiritual leader almost as if it's the gospel truth. You know, and the reason is because spiritual leaders are supposed to be our guides when it comes to whatever religion. In the case of Christianity, when it comes to God and serving God, from time immemorial, if you look at the Bible all the way from the beginning, there has always been a leader. Before, it used to be the prophets and the judges who were the intermediaries between God and his people. And even in the New Testament, when where the curtain got divided in half when Christ died, and we now have direct access to God, we now have a personal relationship with God and really do not need a priest, a prophet, or a pastor to be an intermediary. We still have spiritual guides and leaders, and for example, the apostles or the disciples were still leaders in the faith to guide people. But wherever there is a spiritual guide or a leader, there is often trust that is placed in that person, and that trust can be abused. Like any relationship where trust exists, there is potential for abuse there, because spiritual leaders are often not just teachers, they tend to be counselors, and faith and religion is something that is very near and personal and dear to people. It is often where people find comfort from the troubles they are dealing with. Faith is what feeds people's souls and spirits and influences every part of life. So whoever is a guide or a leader over that faith has a very, let's call it, a special place in the heart of the believer. And there is a lot of immense trust that exists between spiritual leaders and their followers. And so, like I mentioned before, just like any relationship where there is trust, there is potential for abuse. And so spiritual abuse is a thing. And what made me interested in speaking on this topic right now is just the immense amount of news I have been seeing about pastors and men of God who are, in the name of Christ, exhibiting all sorts of behaviors, and what the results are, how it's affecting people's faith, people's trust in the church as a whole, and even people's relationship with God. I mean, I have seen stories, stories of pastors abusing their power has always existed, but something about 2020 and COVID just made it so widespread. It was almost as if every week or every other week there is a new story. Even this past week, I came across another one. I have seen stories of pastors who defrauded the church, defrauding the government, especially with that whole PPP loan. There was a pastor who lied and got it and bought luxury cars, and a pastor who lied and got PPP loans, and instead of using it for the church, went and bought herself some real estate. And then I have seen stories of pastors who are engaged in adultery, abusing staff, taking advantage of people, having people work in the church they do not pay. And these people have mansions and houses and at least physically and financially are well off, and yet they take advantage of people's money and they are defrauding the church. So the most recent one I came across is, I believe it's Venue Church, where a pastor was discovered, he's married, but it was discovered he was having an adulterous affair with a member of his church who was also married. And when confronted about it, lied about it until someone saw he and his mistress out at lunch, canoodling in public, and took a picture and circulated it on Facebook. And then he confessed to it, left, gave up preaching for about 3 weeks, and came back. He's like, well, God has changed me. I'm back. I'm like, how? That, to me, that wasn't even enough time for self-reflection. And he also admitted to using funds from the church for so on and so forth. I I was a bit, I am always torn when I see stories like that, but there have been so many that I'm beginning to expect to see them in a way. And I worry about the effect it has on people. Like, I've seen people who say, these kind of stories is why I stopped going to church altogether. Or these kind of stories is why I stopped being a Christian. Now, I have a lot to say about that, and it ties in with the second half of this topic, which is pastor worship or the worship of spiritual leaders. If a person's behavior is what is causing you to lose a relationship with God, to me, you never believed in God in the first place. Your faith was tied to a human being and not to God himself. But we will dive deeper into that topic in part 2 of this video. But when it comes to spiritual abuse, I had a couple of thoughts about people who set themselves up as spiritual leaders. Why are we seeing more and more of this story? I mean, we are seeing more of the stories because social media makes the passing of news and the dissemination of information a lot more accessible and easier. But why is spiritual abuse so rampant? And to me, I have several thoughts on that. One of them is, often people see being a pastor, a preacher, or a spiritual leader as a business opportunity and not a calling. For some people, it's a way to make tax-free money, especially in the United States. For some people, it is a way, not just business opportunity. It is a way to get status and respect in the community. In any religion, spiritual leaders are often viewed through a different set of lens. There is some honor that is accorded to spiritual leaders. There is a certain reverence with which they are treated, and some people crave that. And for them, the easiest way to do that is to set themselves up as spiritual leaders. For a lot of people, they are just perverted, and the easiest way for them to practice their perversion is to take advantage of people's spiritual beliefs. Now, I've seen some weird videos on YouTube of pastors doing the most ridiculous things. I mean, I've seen videos of pastors fondling women in front of their husbands and fathers in the name of praying for them. I think I saw one where a pastor was bathing the members of his church in public for whatever. Just, I've seen some really weird things, and I try not to judge because there are some things that are so outlandish, and in my head, I'm saying, this isn't medieval times when we do not have access to the Bible. Regardless of how much we need spiritual leaders and guys, in these times, we have the Bible. There are certain things, if it's not in the Bible and your pastor is doing it, you should be asking questions. There are things I've seen, videos that have been recorded, behaviors pastors have exhibited, I've seen, and for the members who allow themselves to be subjected to that treatment, I often question, but I am truly trying not to judge, because I also understand how it is, how out of desperation sometimes people turn to the church or turn to spirituality or religion out of desperation because of what is happening in their lives. And some people, I've seen videos of a church where the pastor asked his congregation, those that are sick, to go out and literally go on their hands and knees and chew grass as if they were animals. And at first it looked so outlandish, and my initial reaction was, what are these people thinking? Like, when I think of, oh good Lord, when I think of, for example, let's say animals that have gone through and done all sorts of mess and human feet, and you just go and you eat because your pastor said to. But when I thought about it, these were the poorest people in the community, some so sick, and in places where this was a certain, but I believe this was in Africa somewhere, and I'm forgetting which country, who could not afford to get treatment. Literally could not afford it. Some couldn't even can't afford to eat, or at that time couldn't afford to eat, and then it needed help. And to them, it's like, if eating grass is what is going to heal me, why won't I do it? Because they literally have no other place to turn to. It's either not do it or death. They have to believe that that's what will heal them or bring some measure of relief to them. So I do understand how desperation sometimes drives people to um to subject themselves to spiritual abuse, to allow themselves to be victims of an abusive relationship with a spiritual leader. And I detest with all that I have spiritual leaders who take advantage of people who are just desperate like that. Another reason why spiritual abuse exists is people don't have training. Some spiritual leaders are not trained. Some are called, but they forget you need to undergo training. Even the disciples didn't just become apostles and leaders in Christianity. They all trained under Christ. And then the people who took over from them trained under them. Sometimes there is no training. They're like, I have a calling, an anointing, and they open something, and they are charismatic, and it blows up so quickly. And there is no training. A lot of spiritual leaders are not accountable to anybody. So especially a lot of, I mean, it happens in churches of any size, but we often hear stories of all these mega churches with campuses and parishes here and there, because a lot of them do not have anyone they are accountable to. They are so charismatic, they've blown up, they're popular on social media, and they think they're all that and 2 cents. And it is so easy in those situations for arrogance to creep in. But if there is no one who holds you accountable, who holds them accountable, it is easy for that behavior to get out of hand and lead to other things. And even if they have someone who they are supposed to be accountable to, it is important that they learn to be subjected, or rather, they learn to allow themselves to be held accountable. Arrogance and pride. A lot spiritual leaders need to be on the watch for arrogance and pride. But those are some of the reasons why I think spiritual abuse exists. Now, when one of the stories came out, I'm forgetting which church, what the name of the church is, but it's a pastor. I believe is it Pastor John Gray? When one of a scandal that had to do with another woman broke out, I think it was either for the second time or something like that. People were attacking him, and he took some time off from his church. And when he came back to preach, people were asking, very much like I was asking about a pastor or venue church, why is he back so soon? Has he really taken enough time to reflect? And a lot of people made a comment, well, pastors or preachers or evangelists, ministers, bishops, etc., they are human beings too. They are subject to making mistakes. While, I mean, they are human beings, of course, and they make mistakes. However, they are judged harshly or held to a higher standard for two reasons. Number one, if you are going to put yourself in a place where you are leading and guiding others, where you are making yourself an authority when it comes to spirituality and faith and religion, you are supposed to be held to a higher standard of conduct. How do you teach and lead people when you're operating on the same level, or even worse, on a lower level than the people you are leading? To me, it's not that different than going to a school and having a math teacher who has just about the same knowledge as his or her students. If there was an exam and the math teacher is on the same level of knowledge as a student, that is an issue. Obviously, when it comes to that subject, because the teacher has placed themselves in a position where they say, I am more knowledgeable, at least than my students on this topic, they are judged harsher than the students would be. And to me, that's the same thing with pastors and preachers. Of course, they are judged. To me, if there is punishment being given out for, at least here on earth, sin is sin, and God, we know God is a fair judge. But here on earth, if there are rules and regulations in place and ways of conduct, and if there is behavior that is dictated by faith, and people who have chosen to put themselves in a leadership position as spiritual leaders, it's not like they were conscripted. They were called by God, and they made the decision, I'm going to be a spiritual leader. They are supposed to be held at a higher standard. The second part of that is, it's in the Bible. The Bible tells us all about the punishment. Or is it punishment? Not really, but the expectation that anyone who makes themselves a teacher of the word should expect to be judged harshly, or on a stricter curve than members would be. I am referencing James chapter 3 verse 1. The book of James chapter 3 verse 1, and I am going to read it in a couple of different versions of the Bible. So the first one is Amplified. Not many of you should become teachers, serving in an official teaching capacity, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who are teachers will be judged by a higher standard, because we have assumed greater accountability and more condemnation if we teach incorrectly. So that's the Amplified version. That is James chapter 3 verse 1. I'm going to read two more. Let me see. Good News Translation. My friends, not many of you should become teachers. As you know, we teachers will be judged with greater strictness than others. Um, Let me see. King James Version says, My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. Message Version, I love this one, says, Don't be in any rush to become a teacher, my friends. Teaching is highly responsible work. Teachers are held to the strictest standards, and none of us is perfectly qualified. We get it wrong nearly every time we open our mouths. If you could find someone whose speech was perfectly true, you'd have a perfect person in perfect control of life. This is why you do not rush to become a spiritual leader, especially if you're not called or you don't know what you're doing. I'll read the last one. I'll read is NIV. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. So if there is anyone who is going to set themselves up as a spiritual leader, there needs to be expectation that they'll be judged stricter. You don't become a pastor or a preacher and then when you misbehave, expect you're going to be judged or treated like a regular member of your church would be. That does not make sense. Okay, the last thing I want to say on this topic is if there is a spiritual leader, especially those who are knowingly misbehaving. I mean, a mistake is something, to me, a mistake is anybody can make a mistake. Like I read in the Message translation, nobody's perfect. There is no perfect human being on earth. Anybody can make a mistake. But when you are carrying on an adulterous affair for years or months, when you are abusing members of the church, young girls, people of age, be it sexually, emotionally, physically, when you have stolen money from the church, when you are verbally abusive, when you are deliberately twisting scriptures to suit your needs, when you are abusing the mental well-being of your members by telling them God said so and so when you know he did not say, when you are issuing false prophecies whose end goal is for your personal satisfaction, to prop yourself up and make yourself feel good, when you are issuing edicts that do not come from God, those are deliberate actions to me. When you are doing the same, you are doing it on purpose. That is not that is no longer a mistake. And for anyone, and when I say for anyone who has put themselves up, or put themselves in a position to be a spiritual leader or a teacher or someone who talks about the faith, and I am including myself, it is very important to be aware of two things. You are going to give account of the souls who follow you or the souls you listen to. Anyone you teach and you lead, God is going to demand an accounting of those souls from you. And that is anyone in a leadership position. Hebrews 13:17 says, Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give an account. So everyone who has, what do I want to call them, subjects or people who follow, are going to give an account to God for those people. Now, this includes anybody. I'm talking about political leaders. You know, all these people who run for office and decide, you run for office to lead cities and impact people's lives, and you get there and you're doing all sorts of things and being all kinds of corrupt. There is going to be an accounting before God. It's to me, it also applies to husbands. I know a lot of married men or friends who have gotten married and relatives and so on. who keeps saying, the place in Ephesians, wives, be submissive to your husband. They quote that scripture ad nauseum. Wives, be submissive to your husband. And they forget two things. That verse has a part 2, which is, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. And Christ loved to the extent that Christ gave his life for the church. They skip that part entirely, and they never do that. And then they never get to Hebrews 13:17. If you're going to rule over anybody, remember you're going to give an account to God for that person. Spiritual leaders also, something else they need to keep in mind. I'm reading First Timothy chapter 3 from verse 1. If a man desires the office of a bishop or overseer, he desires a good work. Now it gives qualities to me. I'm a bishop is, to me, is any spiritual leader, any position, a pastor, a preacher, what have you. Okay, going further, a bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. First Timothy chapter 3. For me, that is a guiding principle for anyone who decides to become a spiritual leader. You have to be blameless. I mean, I'm probably going to do another video on just that verse alone. There is so much to unpack there. But the most important thing I wanted to end with is, if there is someone who is a spiritual leader, someone in your family who does that, or if you are, take note that you are going to be held accountable for the souls that you lead. So if you're out there wilding out, exhibiting all sorts of behaviors, if your behavior impacts somebody negatively and they leave the church, and it impacts their relationship with God, yes, they are going to be held accountable for your faith, but you as the leader, you're also going to take part in the blame or share in the punishment, because you are going to be held accountable for that. So it is important. That's something I don't think a lot of people who decide to be pastors are aware of, that they are going to be held accountable for every single soul they affect, good or bad. You get rewarded or punished. Either way, there is accountability from God, whether you subject yourself to someone else or not. So right now, those are my thoughts on the topic of spiritual abuse. I would love to, and this is probably also going to be maybe a project, something I'm going to work on, that I might speak on a later episode, because I would like to dive into, well, how do we avoid it? How do we educate and arm the Christian congregation so they are not subject to spiritual abuse, the same way we teach women about signs of, or teach anyone really about signs of physical abuse and resources where to get help when it happens? I want to do the same thing for Christians. I'm interested in that. How do you recognize signs of spiritual abuse, and how you get yourself out of that situation? Are there resources available? So I'm gonna dive into that. I think it is definitely something worth looking into. So perhaps after part 2 of this video, I will just continue the topic and maybe invite 1 or 2 people to speak about it as well. So those are my final thoughts. Let me know what you think. Just leave me comments. Feel free to comment below, or on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or wherever I am. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next episode. Remain blessed.